I just turned it up until it started going. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure how these work.
I've been turned down 69.
So for any of our friends that haven't been here, we meet every Thursday, and we call this Journey Through the Bible. And if you ever want to join us, you are welcome to. We are currently going through Exodus, and I wanted to show you online. We keep it all recorded, and we have all of our presentations and any material that we bring. And so if you ever wanted to join in, we have fun, or at least I do, and I think other people do too. But once a month, we do a special topic because this church volunteers with Fish Food Pantry, and Thursdays at the last week of the month, I think, is it the 4th? Usually the 4th, okay, is when a lot of people go and volunteer. And so we do a special topic, and usually we'll play some videos, and I like doing that because it gives me kind of a break week. Except this week. I did more study this week in light of what we're going to talk about today, which is the Israel and Palestinian conflict. So we have this map that is going to keep popping up, and I just want to familiarize ourselves with this map. So the blue is the state of Israel. The red is what we would call Palestine, which is in two parts, the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. And you'll notice this map has East Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is, as a city, is kind of divided. So East Jerusalem is set aside, and it is what the Palestinians would call their capital, whereas West Jerusalem would be what the state of Israel would call their capital, though all of those terms have asterisks on them because some regions claim both sides, so it's a little complicated. This is Journey Through the Bible, though today we're not going to do the Bible. I'm going to pass around as well throughout what we're going to talk about different handouts. So one of the things that we're going to look at is this handout, which I really like this one because it's easy to read. It comes from a website called Traveling Israel. So this source has more of a kind of pro-Israel point of view, and you can very much tell that because at the end of the timeline, it says 1948 State of Israel, and it has no mention of Palestinians on it. And so some of the sources that we're going to look at are going to be differing in their perspectives. This timeline is more in depth, and it is an interactive timeline. I will link to this on the website when I send out the material because I couldn't get it printed out any bigger than this. And it was something I had to buy for us to look at because it's a really large file. But what's cool about it is each thing that you interact with has more information about each of those points. So I will try to link all of those. And I put two of these out so we can pass those around and look at them. There is some more handouts that I'm going to wait to pass out until we pop up to them in the presentation. So I wanted to give like a kind of disclaimer for what we're going to do today. So a lot of the material we're going to look at might make you uncomfortable. And my encouragement for you is to lean into the uncomfortableness and realize that some level of you will be uncomfortable. There is one video, and I'm going to put a warning before we watch it, that will probably make you upset. It is about a Palestinian man talking about his village being wiped out, and he's going to talk about people dying, and it's going to show some violent footage. We'll give a disclaimer before we get there, but that is the first video we're going to watch, and my hope in watching that video first is we'll learn to be a little more sympathetic. So some of the things we are going to look at might question your long-standing political beliefs. They might confuse your theology, and they might stretch your comfort level. And so just as a disclaimer, that's some of the things we're going to do over the next hour. So we're going to do a Billy thing, and we're all going to do a deep breath together. Okay. We might take these deep breaths throughout our lesson. The other disclaimer I wanted to say is I am not a geopolitical expert. I am a nerdy guy, and I happen to work a job where I can spend a few hours of my week nerding out on different projects. I like studying different Israel and Palestine things, but I am not a geopolitical expert. And so we'll take that disclaimer as it will. This is a topic that's of special interest for me, so I did try to take special sensitivity in preparing today's presentation, but I also wanted to bring in a couple of different videos. And as I put in the reminder last night, I have one that's a very neutral kind of point of view, and then we're going to have one that is a little bit more pro-Israel and one that's a little bit more pro-Palestine. And I wanted to share sources that kind of cover all the different sides, but are all reputable when you watch any of them by themselves. Before I move on to our next slide, does anyone want to share anything or ask any questions before we move forward? Okay, great.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Come do this for us, please.
If there's an orange powered button, you can turn it off.
But the sign says not to. I'll turn it off, you said to. It's off.
Oh, that's the.
It was off when I walked in.
It says don't use the emergency shut off.
And I have no idea what this is, the emergency shut. It is off now. It is off now.
Oh,
Something's
the
off.
emergency shut off is that. Oh,
I guess that's if it gets really hot or something. What is it, Mike? Oh, it's my keys. So I want to go over just a few terms that we're going to use today that I think can help us. So one is Hebrews. Hebrews is the term when we're doing Bible study and things for the people that speak Hebrew. And so we've talked about that. And here there is an ancestor for the Israelites called Eber or something like that. And a lot of different nerdy Bible scholar people would say that's kind of the ancestor of the Hebrews. It's not a term we usually use today, but it's one in Bible times. We'll talk about the Hebrews as those people before there was like a kingdom of Israel or something like that. We also have biblical Israel, and that is, when we're studying the Bible, the nation of Israel. That was ruled by King Saul and King David and King Solomon and throughout all those other times.
I have a question. This is really elementary that I need to clarify. The nation of Israel was not a physical place. It was a people. Is that right?
In today or like in Bible times? So there were a group of people called the Hebrews, and then at King Saul, they began to make out a place for them that was centralized around Jerusalem. And so like King David conquered Jerusalem, and that's what we call the kingdom of Judah or the kingdom of Israel.
Okay.
So like in the biblical narrative, there's a northern kingdom of Israel and a southern kingdom of Judah that split under Solomon.
And is that the same physical place?
Yes.
Israel
Yes.
is today?
Correct.
Okay.
And I actually took that part out of my presentation, but yes, it is. I had to weed out some things that I thought we were a little too long. So then there is the modern nation state of Israel. And we call the people that live there Israelis. And that nation state was made in 1948, which is, if you're checking a calendar, pretty recent. And so we're going to talk about that timeline of who has occupied this region and who has been the occupiers. And then there is Jews. So Jews comes from the Jewish religion. It is both an ethnic and religious identity. I meant to have the slash through ethnic, not religious. I put that in the wrong place. Because for most of history, to be a Jew was a religious identity, not an ethnic identity. There was a movement in the 1800s because of Jewish persecution.
Nancy. I'm sorry, Alexander.
Hi, Nancy.
In here.
I'm sorry I interrupted. It was an impulse.
So there was a movement in the 1800s, and the terminology of being Jewish began to shift from only a religious identity to also include an ethnic identity. And so today, to be Jewish is religious and ethnic. Does that make sense? Okay, great. Okay. So our next set of terms we're going to look at is Palestine. So this area of the world is called Palestine. It began to be called that during the Roman occupation, and throughout when the Ottomans conquered in the 1500s, this whole area was called Palestine. We get it because of funny language words. And so when we call this land Palestine, throughout most of history, that is how we would refer to it.
The whole area.
This whole area of Israel and the Gaza Strip and West Bank. Some people also call it the Levant, and that's another term that you might not hear that often, but you can also use. Palestinians are those who live in Palestine. It is ethnic, not religious, so the Palestinian makeup is a Muslim majority, but a Christian minority, and usually they're ethnically Arabian or Arabic, they speak Arabic, but not necessarily. It's just a subculture of those who have lived in this region for about 1,000 years. And then there is two places, already mentioned this, the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. And then there is Hamas. So has anybody heard Hamas in the news lately? We'll talk more about this, but Hamas is the ruling authority in the Gaza Strip. They are also a terrorist group, but there is no centralized government in the Gaza Strip. Hamas is kind of the regional power there. There's also the West Bank, and they have what's called the Palestinian National Authority. The Palestinian National Authority used to rule over both places until Hamas, and we will go in more detail about that. Any questions from this part so far? Okay, all right. Oh, questions. Sometimes I forget to ask if people have questions. One thing I thought it would be fun to kind of look at is asking, is this a theology or a political question that is the root of this conflict? I'm going to say this is more of a political issue than a theology issue, though it is important to know that Israel or the Holy Land or Levant or Palestine and Jerusalem, it is a holy site for three major world religions: Islam, Christianity, and Jews. There's about 16 million Jews in the world today. There's almost 2 billion Christians and another 2 billion Muslims in the world today. And all are going to claim some kind of religious connection to this land. So we're dealing with that's like half the world that is going to talk about this as an important place for them. And so there is going to be theology involved, but this is primarily a political issue. The other thing to know is that Palestine, for about the past 1,000 years, has largely been an Arabic population with an Islamic majority. Today, there's still a Christian minority there. And it wasn't until later that European settlers with a Jewish identity began to move into the area. And today, that population is still almost half and half, with a slightly more Jews than there is Palestinians in the area, which to me I found to be interesting. It's just over 6 million in both parts. And we're going to look at this map in more detail. You'll be surprised when you see where those 6 million Palestinians are concentrated. So the other question is, what is our goal? I met with Howard Hess yesterday, who's my spiritual director. And I was like, I am nervous about doing this presentation because I am sure someone's going to be upset. If not, everyone will be upset. And I don't like being controversial, and I don't like conflict. And so he asked me, he's like, what's the point? Why are you going to do this? And so I told him my hope is that we can have a deeper compassion for displaced and oppressed people, and that my compassion for one displaced and oppressed people doesn't make me lose my compassion for another displaced and oppressed people. That is my goal for today. And so the whole Israel-Palestinian conflict, it's complicated. There's not an easy solution. We will talk about what kind of the international community as well as the Episcopal Church states as a solution. But it's not easy, and it's complicated. And I think that's the best way to describe it. My hope is that we'll learn to be a more compassionate people after today and realize a little bit more of the nuances and kind of what's happened over 2,000 years in this place, which if you did watch the one video I had sent last week, Jerusalem is the most conquered city that we have of an historical record. And it happens to be in this big crossroads throughout all the world. And so no wonder. Okay. Also, reality check. And this is the part that you might get uncomfortable, but we want to go ahead and state it now. For the international community, the state of Israel is the aggressor and the oppressor. And they have an illegal occupation of Palestine in the West Bank and Gaza. And it's a borderline genocide. This is the view of the international community, like from the United Nations. With that said, Hamas is also a terrorist organization, and no support should be given for any organization that murders civilians and children. And so we need to learn to kind of hold both of these things in our mind and realize the kind of nuances in the conversation. And the other thing is that Israelis and Palestinians are people, and they're not the organizations. And the hope for is any people we have compassion. Before we move on, does anyone want to have a conversation about this? Because we will look into all of these parts in more detail as we move forward.
Well, do you call Israel an aggressor and oppressor because they now have more land than they were originally given in 1948?
So yeah, so we're gonna look in like how the state of Israel became a state, but there was a plan from the UN to partition land Palestine that made a Jewish state, and those borders that we kind of mark off as the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. I'll show this chart here. This is, wait, do I have the other one? I think I have it up here. This is what it looks like about 10 years ago.
Oh, okay.
And these places are almost all cut off. So the yellow here is the Palestinian villages that are left. And so kind of, we have a video that will go in more detail, but there are state-sponsored Jewish settlements that are Israeli settlements that are slowly taking over all of the Palestinian villages. And they go in with bulldozers and they knock down villages. And then as citizens move in, the military comes and follows to keep their citizens safe. And so that expansion of settlements is illegal, and it meets the definitions of a genocide, as it's a wiping out of a people that have lived there for 1,000 years.
And that's the who?
That's is Israeli settlements that are moving into the West Bank. Yes, yeah. And so with that in mind, as we have talked about the Exodus in this class, what's kind of ironic is that it's a story about Israel getting away from an oppressor. And for the Palestinians, that story of the Exodus is their story, as they have become kind of the refugees. And so it's a very complicated situation. And so we'll move through some of that and how it kind of divulged.
You might have covered this. I'm sorry, I was late. But in the Bible, when it talks about Israel, is it talking about that whole big area that you labeled Palestine? Or
Yes, yeah.
is
So
that
yeah.
whole big area?
So Palestine was the regional territory under the Roman Empire, is what they called part of this. Under the Ottomans, this whole region came to be known as Palestine, which the Ottomans took power in about the 1500s. Since then, this area, like we call Palestine, until about 1948, when the state of Israel was kind of divided it in half.
Even though in the Bible, you don't see the word Palestine, you see the word Israel. As
Correct.
The name of the nation.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, hey, that's this map up here. So we kind of said this before, but Palestinians are those who have lived here in Palestine for 1,000 years. Usually that's going to be those who are speaking Arabic. Usually they're Muslim, but there's also a pretty strong Christian minority that's here as well. And we're going to look at a timeline of how this happens. I guess since I already have showed that, I'm going to pass this graph around. This is going to show the expansion with a timeline of how the official like power structures have changed with who rules what area.
Why is there not a contiguous yellow on the last four?
So yellow is Palestine. So I guess we'll go ahead and start to walk through this. So there was never a nation state called Palestine. This whole region of the Middle East was it was under the Ottoman rule after World War I. Because of colonialism, it was divided up between primarily French and British rule. And so the south area was under the British mandate. Up north, like Lebanon, and up here is going to be under French rule. And, that never quite goes well.
Yeah.
And so there is a people here in this area that began to develop their own ethnic identity. They began to call themselves Palestinians. They had their own dialect of Arabic. They had their own food culture, and they're in their own specific region right here. But this is kind of before the days of nation states are kind of rising up everywhere. So in about the 1800s, there begins to be a lot of European Jewish settlers that begin to move in. They buy land from landowners, and they make kind of like communes, essentially. And they move in, they farm the land, and they're trying to make a Jewish homeland. If you're curious, a lot of the international community, like before the United Nations, but they're like, we don't know what to do with all these Jews because we don't want them in Europe because no one likes Jews at this time. And so they looked at a lot of different places. They thought about South America. They thought about Africa. And then they were like, oh, hey, we'll just poke them over there in Israel, even though there's already a people there, but because they has historical ties because of the Bible. And so they were like, that sounds good. So they just kind of started sending out the Jews into these settlements here, which is kind of under British rule. And at first it was encouraged by the British rulers. And so that was essentially because it helped the British keep both sides fighting each other, and they didn't fight the Brits ruling the area. And so that ends up getting really complicated, and so the Brits just go, we don't want it anymore. And so they just gave it away. The day before the British Mandate ruled is in 1948. Israel declares itself a state. I forgot. Before that, so this was the UN partition plan. So this was what the United Nations said, we're going to divide the land here. About 1/3 of the population here was Jewish. The other 2/3 are Palestinian. But they divide the land roughly in half, and they give the farmable land to the Jews. And so the Palestinians say, we don't accept that plan. And then after the nation of Israel declares itself to be a state, there becomes a big war where all of the Arabian League around here declares war on Israel, and they don't win. And so the result of that, which I don't have in here, and we have a video that will show some more detail, but over the course of two big wars over like the next 50 years, Israel expands. They take all of the Sinai Peninsula. They take up and part of Lebanon, and they take some other regions over here across the other side of the Jordan. There comes to be a peace treaty where they give all of that land back to the other nations, and the state of Israel comes kind of to be in peace with the Arabian nations around them, except the Palestinians, which is filled with a lot of refugees that are in the area. And so what's left is the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. And I know this is in the east. It's called the West Bank because it's west of the Jordan. And so this is what it looked like after the war and after the settlement. So this is as of 2012. The green regions are occupied by the Israeli military.
And how much of that green is pure desert?
So a lot of it is desert, and I think it's the first video we're going to watch is going to talk about this. They reforested a lot of the area to cover up the ruins of the villages. And so a lot of it has like new generation forest that weren't there before. But most of the like farmable land is up here and is around over here.
Historically, going back as long as we can study history, territorial disputes have been about resources.
Yeah.
What resource, if any, is in Israel or Palestine that they covet? Evidently it's not oil, it's not uranium.
There is a lot of oil here.
There is a lot.
Yeah.
Okay. Is it diamonds? Is it gold? Is it sea? They have a lot of seafront, Mediterranean seafront.
Yeah.
Is it, shipping ports. I can't wrap my head around what is it that we're really coveting.
So do you all remember the map? I'm going to pull it up on my website that we have.
They want it because it's theirs.
So here's a big old world map. So Egypt has the Nile River, which makes it very, very fertile lands. And over here is the Tigris and the Euphrates. That fertile crescent makes it very fertile lands. So in the ancient world, these are the two powerhouses. Big civilizations come out of here. There's a crossroads right in between all of them. If you know anything about highways, like here in Knoxville, right between two interstates, commerce goes there. It also happens to be the trade route if you go from the Mediterranean to get to Persia, which is over here. So we're right in the middle of two major trade routes, which makes it really valuable. So that's kind of one of the biggest regions. It also just so happened that it developed some of the world's major religions are centered here around their holy sites. And I don't think that we should undermine like the role that's going to take in the Middle Ages and today. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
That was a good question. I should have had a picture like that up there.
So Britain owned all that land before it was partitioned in 1948?
They ruled it. Yes. It was the day before the British Mandate ended that the state of Israel declared themselves to be a state. I think we're actually going to have a video of the speech there. I can't remember which video that's in. Here's another picture. I thought this one was just a little bit more clear. So here are some of the Jewish settlements by 1947. So this is when we're declaring ourselves a state, is right here. This was the UN partition plan. So again, about 1/3 of the population is Jewish, 2/3 are Palestinian. And then they set aside Jerusalem to be administered by the United Nations because of its controversy of who it should go to. This is how it ended up happening. And as of 2005, these are the settlements. And what you might notice is that all of these Palestinian villages and regions are separated from each other, and that's intentional because people can't rally together if they're separated. Here is another picture. This is, if you really want to know like some of the modern history, I'm going to pass this around. And I don't want to spend too much time looking at this chart because we're going to have videos that are going to explain some of this. Oh, and then if you're one who doesn't like videos and you're more like kind of reading things, a really cool website called My Virtual World Trip. And this website, there's a search bar, you can search Israel. There's 2 articles on Israel. And one of them will say History of Israel Timeline. And that's this article. This is a really, really long read, and it has links to other sources. And that's where I found this chart right here. As you can probably guess from the name of the article, it's going to be a little bit more pro-Israel, but it was still a really good source, and that's where I got this, which I'm going to pass back around for anyone else to look at it again. Oh, hey, this chart. This chart, I already passed it around. I thought that this was cool. I just wanted to slowly walk through it, though. So ancient Israel was what we're going to call biblical Israel. And so it used to be the land of the Canaanites. Modern biblical scholarships, and when they do genetic tests, would look at Israelis as just Canaanites. And they were one Canaanite tribe that came to rule over the other Canaanite tribes. They kind of conquered the Canaanites and ruled out because there was some conquering of the land when the Philistines moved in and kind of conquered. They were from my brain has gone blank. They were from Macedonia on boats that came and conquered the land, and they wiped out the Philistines, and so there was a vacuum. And so Israel kind of took over that vacuum where a lot of the other Canaanite tribes died, and they were the tribe that kind of won out. So they're ruling there for a good long time until empire happens. And so they are conquered at first by the Egyptians until about the 1200s. Then they're conquered by the Assyrians, and then later by the Babylonians, who are going to come and wipe out Jerusalem. And so at that moment, Jerusalem gets completely destroyed and leveled, and no one lives there. And that happens for a few generations until the Persians conquered the Babylonians. And the Persians looked at the Israelites, which at this time they start to call Jews, because they were from the tribe of Judah. And they say, if you can make peace amongst yourselves, we will build you a temple and we'll build your city for you again. And that happens to be when the Bible was written, because we've talked about this and here are different sources get put together that are different kind of factions of the Hebrews with their different religious traditions. And the Bible comes together. And so the Persians rebuild the temple, they rebuild the city, and everything is actually going really, really well during that time. And then Alexander the Great comes, and he conquers the land. And Alexander the Great's empire gets split into four, and the Seleucids are those who come, and they are reigning over the land of Palestine. And they end up building this idol in the temple to Jupiter. And so the Jews in the land are like, we can't have that. You can reign over us, but you can't offend our God. And so there comes this Jewish revolt, and it's in the book of Maccabees, which is in some churches' Bibles. And this is the Hasmonean dynasty that's right here. So they only last about 100 years, but there is an independent ruling Jewish kingdom. And then the Romans come in 63. And so the Romans are going to rule this area essentially until the 600s. When the Arab nation is going to come in and the Arab Empire is going to come in and conquer it. And so during that time, the Romans multiple times destroy all of Jerusalem. And it kind of has a few back and forths about who rules Jerusalem in the area. But it's eventually going to become a Christian area and the Jews are expelled. So during this time is when the diaspora happens. And Jews are going to spread throughout all of the world. They're going to go to a lot of Europe. They're going to go into different parts of Africa and just kind of everywhere. So then in 600, there's the Arab Empire, and they're going to rule there for a while. And then there's the Crusades. And the thing to know about when the different Arabian empires were here, different Jews and Christians and Muslims lived in Jerusalem and in Palestine pretty peaceably until the Crusaders come. The Crusaders kill all the Muslims and all the Jews, and they destroy Jerusalem, and then they rebuild it. And that is going to have a lot of back and forth battles for a few hundred years, essentially until the Ottomans come. They're going to rule from the 1500s until 1917 after World War I, when there's the British Mandate, and they take over. Was that clear?
Yes.
What do you see a common theme? Conquering, conquering, conquering. The land gets wiped out. This is a land that's going to be filled with a lot of conflict. It's a land that lots of populations are moving in and moving out. And for about 1,000 years, there is, though, one standard population, and they begin to call themselves Palestinians. Things start to change really, really weird when the Brits start saying, we're going to make a Jewish nation here. And the Palestinians go, wait, we've been here 1,000 years. This is my home. But then you also have Jews saying, I have no home, and we're being killed everywhere we go. And so it's a complicated situation, and I hope we have feelings and compassion on both sides. And that's the same thing. Oh, here's another resource that I liked. Does anyone know what Britannia is? It's like a dictionary, encyclopedia.
Encyclopedia Britannia.
So, they have a kids version, and there's a kids version of this that is worth reading. They have a website, too. I didn't know there was a paper version.
As
that
a
shows me.
librarian, I have to just say it's the ultimate well-researched source.
I love their articles.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So they have a great kids article that's called Palestine, and I would highly recommend a look at that one. We already covered that, so I'm not gonna say that. So this is going to be a slide about the population makeup throughout the ages. So this is almost 1880. We're going to see that most of the people that live here are going to be Islamic. There's a small Christian minority, and these are the Jewish settlers that are going to begin to move in. So if you saw the one map with this kind of sparse yellow or green or whatever color it was, there's a few Jews that are beginning to move in. And at this point, they're fleeing ethnic discrimination because if you're a Jew in Europe, people don't like you. And so there wasn't much of a good place that you could go. And so they begin moving back to their homeland. We call this movement the Zionist movement. And it's the Jews began to think of themselves more as an ethnic connection, and they want to find a place for themselves where they're not going to experience discrimination.
Do we know what
Christians are mean.
Pardon?
Christians are mean.
Okay, that's
That's
the dislike of Jews?
Yeah, that's going to be most of the answer. It's really the Christians or Christendom. This is going to show a population jump from 1922 to 1931. Any guesses why we're going to start to see a big jump here? Yeah, these are between the world wars when things are starting to get pretty bad. This is that check-in 1931. We're still only about 10% or 20% of the population is going to be Jewish. That's going to vastly change by 1947. 1/3 of the population is going to be Jewish. Remember, 1947, this is when the UN makes their plan. It's after World War II. They say we really need to find a place for people to live that, like the Holocaust has just happened. And so that's what's in the minds of the international community. This is the video that I sent. We don't have time to watch it today, but it's the one from Useful Charts. And I like the clip here because I could not find anywhere that had like a graph of his timeline he made in the video, but it has all the different places. And at the end of the video, he's going to show who reigned in Jerusalem the longest.
Hi, this is Matt Baker. Years, Judea.
Skip ahead. So at the end of it, he counts up who kind of ruled for the longest. So Jerusalem was ruled by Islamic rulers for about 1,200 years, by Judaism for, again, about 1,200 years, and by Christians for about 400 years. There's also others that did pagans or other religions and stuff. So highly recommend this video. He's going to go a lot deeper into history than I did in here. Okay, we're going to switch to watching a video. Before we watch the video, I want to give a disclaimer that the reason I'm playing this video first is because it's an upsetting video. And my hope is that it will prompt compassion in us. It's the one that's an interview from a Palestinian man. He's going to talk about his experiences growing up when the first war comes over and his village is wiped out by an Israeli militia. And so this is before there's a state of Israel, but there was different militia groups that did different things. And it's also going to cover some other facts about the war and the timeline. So it also is going to show some different footage that might be upsetting. So I want to give that disclaimer. Before we watch it, though, does anyone have questions before we start just playing videos?
Well, the interview, at what time does that take place?
This was done 5 months ago.
Oh, okay.
Okay, this is our pro-Palestinian video that we're going to play here. Oh, yeah, I couldn't link it in the presentation, so I have to come up here. This is from a news channel called Vox. I highly recommend Vox as a news source, with the caveat that they are pretty left-leaning, and the op-eds that they have are going to touch more on like progressive topics, but as a news agency, they do really solid reporting.
My village is a very beautiful one. It has a mountain full of trees of figs and grapes, and it faces the main road to Jerusalem.
This is a story about what happened here in 1948.
We were only 750 people, and everybody knows each other. I came from a big family. We lived a good life. We never expected to be massacred. It was a black spot in the history.
That history has been carefully concealed, purposefully distorted, and in the West, largely forgotten.
They put our village as an example of what they can do.
The massacre in this village was one of many in a series of catastrophic events that became known as the Nakba, when hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were violently displaced from their homeland in order to create the State of Israel.
In May of 1948, a new Jewish state, Israel, was born in a bath of blood.
The borders of Palestine have been changed forcefully over time, but historically, this region has been home to Palestinians for centuries, with hundreds of villages and thriving cities. One of them being the central city of Jerusalem, with holy sites important to Jewish, Christian, and Muslim people. By the late Ottoman Empire, Palestinians living here were overwhelmingly Muslim, with minority Christian and Jewish native populations too. But regardless of religion, Palestinians were often referred to as Arabs, people of the Arabic-speaking world, despite their distinctive culture.
Palestinians have long distinguished themselves as Ahl Palestine, or the people of Palestine. They developed a distinctive Arabic accent, they developed regional food, regional dress, and family ties.
But by the time World War I began, several key political forces were competing for control of these lands. First, there was a growing Arab political movement, looking for independence from the Ottoman Empire in hopes of a unified Arab state that would include Palestine. Then there were Zionists, a political group that had one main goal: the creation of a Jewish state. Zionism was a response to an increasingly brutal climate for Jewish people, particularly in Europe and Russia, where there was a massive wave of anti-Semitism, including large-scale attacks in the late 1800s and early 1900s. After briefly considering other areas for a new state, including Uganda and Argentina, Zionist leaders decided on Palestine because of its connection to early religious history. But there was a third key group with political interests here: the British. Control of the region would allow them to expand their spheres of influence and protect trade routes to India. During World War I, since both the British and the Arab independence movement wanted Palestine, they decided to go after the Ottomans together with an important pledge. Through a series of letters in 1916, an Arab leader and a British official agreed that if Arabs would help the British fight the Ottomans and give the British economic and other foreign privileges in Arab lands, in return, the British would recognize and support an independent Arab state. Soon, the Arabs started doing their part in revolting against the Ottomans, making it easier for the British to move in. But the next year, the British issued a new declaration and betrayed the Arabs.
In 1917, Lord Allenby conquered the Holy Land, and the Jews were promised a national home in Palestine.
Without consulting the native Palestinian population, the British issued what's known as the Balfour Declaration, supporting the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. So instead of supporting the idea of Palestine as part of a unified and independent Arab state, the British pledged to help secure this land for Zionists. It was a strategic move. This declaration opened up a pathway for Britain to gain power in Palestine,
under the guise that it was supporting the self-determination of another people, of a people in Palestine who don't reside there yet.
As for Palestine's majority Arab population, the declaration referred to them as non-Jewish communities, who would be given civil and religious rights, but not political rights. A few years later, after World War I ended, Britain gained control of Palestine through a mandate that also required them to put the Balfour plans for Jewish settlement in motion. And they did. Between 1922 and 1931, the Jewish population more than doubled. The migration helped the Zionist movement gain steam, and a slogan took off: a land without people, for a people without land.
And it sends a message to Western leaders that the people who had been living in Palestine for generations could just be easily moved elsewhere. The idea was that those inhabitants weren't a people with ties to that land.
Palestine was, of course, a land with a people. In 1931, there were more than 850,000 Palestinian Arabs in the region, still the vast majority. But with the rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party in particular,
hate became a rallying call.
Jewish flight for Europe became even more urgent, and Palestine started to see the biggest wave of Jewish immigration yet. Violence broke out, rooted in tensions over land. Jewish settlers purchased swaths of fertile land and evicted tenant farmers, creating a crisis of hundreds of thousands of landless, dispossessed Palestinian Arabs. Though Palestinians fiercely rebelled against both British colonial forces and Jewish settlers, they were brutally crushed by the British.
They put in Palestine more troops to repress that rebellion than they had stationed in India at that time, all of India.
These troops killed thousands of Palestinians, including many of their leaders, and the British began training and arming Zionist militias to suppress the rebellion too. But the rebellion continued. So, in an attempt to prevent further Palestinian resistance, the British began to limit Jewish immigration into Palestine. This ended up angering Zionist extremists, leading to more violence. So in 1947, after decades of trying to manipulate both Palestinian Arabs and Zionists to keep their control over Palestine, Britain gave up and handed the question of Palestine to someone else.
To the United Nations also came the problem of Palestine. In recent years, this small country had been the scene of disorder and bloodshed.
They figured, there is this new thing called the United Nations. Here, in your lap, Palestine, first gift. So, the United Nations has now to figure out how do you disentangle this thing that the British helped create.
A UN Special Committee proposed the land be divided into two states, a Jewish state and an Arab state, with Jerusalem as a separate UN-controlled entity. It was called the Partition Plan of 1947. The plan shocked Palestinians.
We could not accept the partition plan because at that time the population were almost 2 to 1.
But the plan proposed giving over half the land, and often the most fertile areas, to the Jewish state.
From a purely pragmatic perspective, the partition plan didn't make much sense for Palestinian Arabs.
That wasn't the only problem with the plan. Within this proposed area of the Jewish state were hundreds of thousands of Palestinian Arabs, including both Muslims and Christians, who had lived there for generations.
On a moral level, the idea of making hundreds of thousands of Palestinian Arabs minorities in their own homeland seemed unjust and unfair.
In November 1947, the UN put the plan to a vote. In the aftermath of the Holocaust, and after lobbying from US leaders and Zionists, the UN voted in favor of partition.
Finally, a momentous decision to partition the Holy Land's 10,000 square miles.
Britain announced their mandate over Palestine would end on May 15, 1948, even as Palestinians continued to reject the UN's decision to partition the land.
After the partition took place, in 1947, we really were scared something might happen to us.
By the end of 1947, Zionists had several well-developed paramilitary forces, the largest one known as the Haganah, and more extremist militias like Irgun. On March 10th, a couple of months before the British mandate would end, the Haganah adopted what was called Plan Dalet, or Plan D. On paper, the main goal was to gain control of the Jewish state as laid out in the partition plan, while also defending Jewish settlements outside of the borders. In reality, that's where the majority of these operations took place, outside of the UN's proposed Jewish state. Some carried out by Haganah and others by more radical militias. Many of these operations focused on isolating Jerusalem and the roads to it. A set of brutal instructions called for the destruction of Arab villages by setting fire to, blowing up, and planting mines, especially those population centers which were difficult to control. In case of resistance, it called for the population to be expelled outside of the borders of the state, villages emptied, and for the occupation and control of Arab villages along main transportation arteries. One of the most widely publicized village massacres happened here in Deir Yassin.
We lived in Deir Yassin, which is about 4 miles west of Jerusalem.
91-year-old Dawood Assad was there the day of the massacre and was 18 at the time.
We saw one night, the night before, the movement of lights, armored trucks moving around, moving like this. So we know that something is wrong. That's why we knew that something is going to happen to our village.
On April 9th, 1948, extremist Zionist forces, executing Plan D, closed in on Deir Yassin, even though the village had made a local peace pact with neighboring Jewish settlements.
Friday morning, they attacked us. My uncles, they were shooting at them, and I was there, loading the gun for them and shooting. We fought about almost 2.5 hours. They found my uncle, and they put him on the wall, and they shot him 8 bullets in cold blood. My grandmother, she went in the village to see my mother. On her way, she got shot. My brother Omar fell from her shoulder to the floor, but the floor was a concrete one.
Dawood escaped through a trench.
I went down all the way down here like this. So about 4 hours walking to Jerusalem.
To this day, the Archive of the Israeli Army refuses to release many of the images and intelligence reports on Deir Yassin. But one UN report detailed circumstances of great savagery, including women and children stripped, lined up, photographed, and slaughtered. Roughly 100 people, largely children and the elderly, were killed in the village. As for Dawood, he later reunited with the group of Deir Yassin captives in Jerusalem, including his sister and mother.
My mother says, "Where is your Uncle Radwan?" He says he was shot. "Where is your grandmother?" He said he was shot, and Umar was with her. So everyone has a commotion, you know. Where's Fatima? Where's Ibrahim? Where's Amaryam? Where is David? Where is Ahmed? Where is Ismail? I'm a dream about it, you know.
News of what happened in Deir Yassin spread quickly, with far-reaching effects.
The Zionist militias used it as a propaganda tool to tell people about it everywhere. The idea was that if you don't leave, we will do to you what happened in Deir Yassin.
Stories came out about women being raped, about babies being killed, and induced a great deal of fear among the Palestinian Arab population, many of them fleeing as a result.
Jewish troops routed Arab forces from the city of Haifa.
After taking Deir Yassin, Zionist paramilitary groups cleared major cities, including Haifa and Jaffa, and took hundreds of smaller villages and towns too. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were forced to flee, pouring into neighboring states as refugees. Plan D became the blueprint for carrying out the ethnic cleansing of historic Palestine to make room for a new state. And on May 14th, the day before the British mandate ended, Zionists declared this state as Israel. But the creation of Israel didn't end the Nakba. Neighboring Arab countries that were overwhelmed by Palestinian refugees immediately went to war with Israel.
Now united in a League of Arab States, they are insistent that the entry of refugees into Palestine must be ended.
The fighting lasted for months. Arab armies eventually lost while Palestinians continued to be killed and forced out throughout that time. Palestinians who fled often carried only enough to stay away for a few weeks, hoping they'd eventually return home.
A lot of them locked their doors, put their key in their pocket, and then moved to safer ground. When you leave the house and you take your key with you, it's because you're planning to go home. In the case of the Palestinians, those refugees weren't allowed to return.
Refugees trying to return were often shot at. Zionist paramilitary operations also tried to prevent them from returning again by destroying the villages.
That act of preventing their return compounded the Nakba. So the Nakba is both the forcible displacement of Palestinians from their homes and lands and country, as well as preventing them to return once the fighting was over.
Palestinian society was dismembered, crushed. More than half of the Palestinian people became refugees, stateless, dispossessed of their land.
Over time, the State of Israel covered up the physical evidence of an Arab Palestine. Place names were often changed from Arabic ones to Hebrew ones. The Jewish National Fund embarked on a massive effort to plant thousands of acres of pine forests and recreational areas on top of hundreds of ruined Palestinian villages.
Even though these forests have now grown into big pine trees, Palestinians have not forgotten their homelands.
While we know that roughly 6,000 Israelis lost their lives in the violence of the Nakba, records for Palestinian deaths weren't kept. It's estimated to be around 15,000. By the end of the Nakba, roughly 750,000 Palestinians had been forcefully expelled, and more than 500 villages destroyed. Though the UN's partition plan allotted Israel 56% of the land, through the Nakba, Israel captured 78% of the land. It was everything except what's now known as the occupied West Bank and Gaza Strip. Today, that's up to at least 85% of the total area, turning 6 million Palestinians into refugees without a homeland. It's why, around the same time that Israelis are celebrating Independence Day, Palestinians are out protesting on May 15th, holding up keys as a symbol of the homes they lost and the hope to return. For them, the Nakba isn't just a moment in history. It's a catastrophe that never really ended.
I'm a dream about it, you know. We lived a good life till 1948 when we were displaced.
Is everyone okay? I think this is the 4th time I've watched this video, and I'm still tearing up when I watch it. I wanted to watch this video because I think it's really humanizing, and it really does a good job about telling the Palestinian story. Sorry, I'm a little choked up. Was this new to anyone watching this? Did this cover new information?
Yes.
I hadn't planned on showing this one, and I wasn't going to show it first. But this morning I rearranged my PowerPoint and I took out some other parts because I thought before we just strictly play a history video, this really helps tell the story. This misses out some of the other parts. So during the Arab War, that was a result of this. It also displaced the same amount of Palestinians that were displaced and left also made Jewish refugees that kind of filled their place back in the land. And so war and conflict is always bad. And so let's remember, with all of this going on, there's millions of people being displaced on both sides that are losing homes. This is kind of a heavy topic to talk through. Sorry, I'm still getting a little choked up. But my hope is we'll learn to be a little bit more compassionate. I think due to time, I'm only going to play one more video. Here's my check-in. Everyone doing okay? I'm glad I remembered to check in. We're going to play one more video. So this video is going to kind of cover the history, at least with the modern conflict, and it's from Crash Course. Has anyone ever heard of Crash Course? So does anyone know who John Green is? He's an author. He wrote The Fault in Our Stars, is like his most popular book. But he and his brother and some other people, they wanted to create an online free curriculum. So even in my high school in history, we would play their like world history videos, like for my history class. And so they created a curriculum in connection with PBS to make Crash Course. So they go through science and philosophy, all these other different ones and topics. And they have different narrators or people that play the video, but the script is written by lots of different people. Great source, and they're free, and you can also get their lesson materials along with it. So, and this is geared for high schoolers, and so it's set up like a high schooler in a classroom, and it kind of has some funny parts in it. So we're going to have a very shift in what we just looked at to this.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course World History, and today we're going to talk about Israel and Palestine, hopefully without a flame war. Yeah, big ask, Mr. Green. I mean, that fight goes back thousands and thousands of years. Except thousands of years ago, there wasn't an Islam yet, so yeah, no. Also, let me submit that very little of this conflict between Israel and Palestine over the last several decades has been about, like, theological differences between Islam and Judaism. No one's arguing about whether the most important prophets descended from Abraham's son Isaac or his son Ishmael, right? It's not about whether to fast during Yom Kippur or Ramadan. It's about land. Portraying the conflict as eternal or as religious makes it feel intractable in a way that, frankly, it isn't. So instead, let's begin, as most historians do, in the late 19th century. And instead of talking about religion, let's follow the lead of historians like James Galvin and discuss competing nationalisms. Okay, so in the late 19th century, the Ottoman Empire ruled over what we now know as Palestine. The population there, according to Ottoman records from 1878, was 87% Muslim, 10% Christian, and 3% Jewish. Everybody spoke Arabic as the daily language, and in Jerusalem, the religious populations were roughly equal. To give you a sense of life in Ottoman Palestine, an Arab Orthodox Christian musician named Wasif Jahariya grew up in Jerusalem in the first decade of the 20th century, learning the Quran in school and celebrating both Passover and Eid with his Jewish and Muslim neighbors. Ottoman Palestine was, in short, a place in which people of different religious faiths lived peacefully together. All right, let's go to the problem. The late 19th century was the golden age of nationalism in Europe, and no place was crazier than the Habsburg Austro-Hungarian Empire, in which at least 10 different nations all wanted their own state. And in that hyper-nationalistic empire lived a Jewish journalist named Theodor Herzl, who had hoped that Jews could assimilate into European nations, but soon became convinced that the Jewish people needed to leave Europe and settle in their own state. The concept of Jewish nationalism came to be known as Zionism. It's important to keep in mind that most Zionists were secular Jews, so they imagined Israel as a state for Jews more than a Jewish state. In 1917, the British government, hoping to gain the support of Jewish people, issued the Balfour Declaration, promising, quote, the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. A bold promise, considering that Palestine was still technically Ottoman, as they hadn't yet lost World War I. Of course, they would soon, but it turned out that the British were over-promisers when it came to Palestine, because a year before the Balfour Declaration, the British had secretly promised the French that they would divide up the Arab territories and the Brits would keep Palestine. Furthermore, in 1915, other British officials had promised the ruler of Mecca, Sharif Hussein, that he would rule over an Arab state, including Palestine, if he led an Arab revolt against Ottoman rule, which Hussein promptly did. So basically, the Brits had promised Palestine to the Meccans, to themselves, and to the Zionists. What could go wrong? Thanks. So shortly after the end of the war, the British established a colony in Palestine with the idea that they'd rule until the Palestinians were ready to govern themselves. At which point the people living in Palestine were like, well, now seems good. And the British were like, yeah, but maybe not just yet. Meanwhile, the British established separate institutions for Christians, Jews, and Muslims, making it difficult for Palestinian Christians and Muslims to cooperate, and easier for the British to, quote, divide and rule the inhabitants of Palestine. Again, what could go wrong? Meanwhile, the British did attempt to honor the Balfour Declaration's promise to, quote, facilitate Jewish immigration under suitable conditions. Between 1920 and 1939, the Jewish population of Palestine increased by over 320,000 people. In fact, by 1938, Jews were just under 30% of the population of Palestine. And the growing Jewish population focused on purchasing land from absentee non-Palestinian Arab landowners and then evicting Palestinian farmers who were living and working there. By controlling both the land and the labor, they hoped to establish a more secure community within Palestine. But of course, these practices heightened tensions between Jewish people and Arab Palestinians during the 1920s and 1930s. Along the way, Palestinian Arabs began to think of themselves as the Palestinian nation, and that growing sense of nationalism erupted in 1936 when the Palestinians revolted against the British. With the help of Jewish militias, the British brutally suppressed the Palestinian revolt, but in the aftermath, the British issued a white paper limiting Jewish immigration to Palestine and calling for the establishment of a joint Arab and Jewish state in Palestine within 10 years. This managed to leave no one happy. The Zionists were angry at Britain for limiting Jewish immigration at a time when Jews particularly needed to leave Europe, and the Arab Palestinians were unhappy about the prospect of waiting 10 years for a state. And then came World War II, which was actually quite a peaceful time in Palestine. But then it ended and tensions resumed, and the British realized that colonies like Palestine were far more trouble than they were worth, so they handed the issue of Palestine over to the newly created United Nations. They were like, oh, hey there, United Nations, for your first problem. So in November of 1947, the United Nations voted to partition Palestine into separate Palestinian and Jewish states. The partition plan called for 2 states roughly equal in size, but the borders looked like a jigsaw puzzle. I mean, you do not look at this map and think, yeah, that's going to work. Sure enough, it didn't. And soon after the plan was announced, the cleverly named 1948 Arab-Israeli War broke out, with Israel on the one side and the Palestinians and many Arab states on the other. The Israelis won, and when an armistice was signed in 1949, Israel occupied a third more land than they would have had under the UN proposal. Meanwhile, Jordan controlled and later annexed the West Bank and the Old City of Jerusalem, and Egypt controlled the Gaza Strip. Over 700,000 Palestinians fled their homes and became refugees in the surrounding Arab countries. To Israelis, this war was the beginning of their nation. To the Palestinians, it was the Nakba, the catastrophe, as they became stateless. Over the next 18 years, nothing changed territorially, and then in 1967, Israel and several Arab states went to war again. It was called the 6 Days War because, get this, it lasted 6 days. Israel won and then gained control over the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Sinai Peninsula, and the Golan Heights. So the 1947 proposal looked like this. By 1967, things looked like this. Then the UN passed Resolution 242. Man, they are good at naming resolutions, which outlined a basic framework for achieving peace, including Israel withdrawing from the territory acquired in the war, and all participants recognizing the rights of both a Palestinian and an Israeli state to exist. Because, of course, course, did not happen. After the war, the broader Israeli-Arab conflict morphed into a more specific Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And this is a nice moment to note that not all Muslims are Arabs, not all Arabs are Palestinians, and not all Palestinians are Muslims. Like, there's a significant Christian minority of Palestinians, for instance. Palestinian is a word used to describe the ethnic identity of those who have historically lived in Palestine. There were, for instance, lots of Christians in the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or PLO, formed in 1964 and led by Yasser Arafat. The PLO oversaw guerrilla groups that attacked civilians, but also used non-violent approaches to try to achieve a Palestinian state. And meanwhile, the Israeli government began to establish Jewish settlements in what had been Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. There are now over 350,000 Jewish settlers in the West Bank and over 200,000 in East Jerusalem. And these settlements are illegal according to international law, but Israel counters by saying that they aren't really illegal because Palestine isn't really a state. By the late 1980s, Palestinians launched the first intifada, which literally means shaking off. And this began with boycotts of Israeli products and services and refusing to pay Israeli taxes. But when the Israeli armed forces cracked down on protesters, violence ensued. And the first intifada also saw the founding of Hamas, which launched the first suicide bombing against Israel in 1993. Hamas gained support partly because of its militancy, but mostly because of its social welfare projects in Gaza. It built and staffed schools, mosques, and clinics. The most important legacy of the First Intifada was the emergence of peace talks between Palestinians and Israelis. This led to the Oslo Accords and a peace process based on our old friend United Nations Security Council Resolution 242. But there were a lot of issues to resolve. I mean, putting aside the question of how to make two states that don't look like a jigsaw puzzle, there was the question of the Jewish settlement and the right for Palestinian refugees and their descendants to return to Palestine, water rights, which are a big deal in that part of the world, and so on. It's very complicated. So then came the Clinton talk. So it's time for the open letter. But first, let's see what's inside of the globe. Oh, look, it's a collection of philandering American presidents. An open letter to Bill Clinton. Hey, Bill, so your talks probably came closer than any other time in recent history to an actual peace deal between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak was willing to give up more land currently claimed by Israel than at any time in the past. Even Yasser Arafat was surprised. Although not all the questions got addressed, you were definitely closing in on something. But in the end, it didn't happen. And since then, not to criticize you, things have gotten kind of worse and worse and worse. Worst of all, that was your big legacy moment. Now all you've got is the conflict in Northern Ireland getting resolved when you were president. In short, it could have been amazing, but instead it was kind of kind of like your presidency, actually. At least you've always had those vodka-soaked hugs with Boris Yeltsin to look back on. Best wishes, John Green. So the Clinton talks failed, Ehud Barak's government was undermined, and then in September of 2000, Prime Minister candidate Ariel Sharon led a group of 1,000 armed guards to the Temple Mount in the Old City of Jerusalem. To Muslims, this is known as the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and it's the third holiest site in Islam, behind only the Kaaba in Mecca and the Prophet's Mosque in Medina. And it's the holiest site in Judaism, so in short, it's a pretty touchy place to march to with 1,000 armed guards. So the event sparked a massive protest, which eventually led to the much more violent Second Intifada, in which more than 3,000 Palestinians and 1,000 Israelis were eventually killed. In 2002, the Israelis, claiming to act in defense of civilians, began construction of a wall around the West Bank, but instead of following the borders established after the 1967 war, the barrier was built to include many Israeli settlements on the Israeli side. To Israelis, that was about self-defense. To Palestinians, it was an illegal land grab. Then in 2005, Yasser Arafat died, and in an election shortly thereafter, Hamas won a majority of the parliamentary seats. Since then, Hamas and the Palestinian Authority have sort of divided how to govern Palestine, and it's also sort of been poorly governed. In the past 10 years, Hamas has frequently launched rocket attacks into Israel. Israel has responded with extended and extremely violent invasions of Palestinian territory that have seen thousands of Palestinians killed, many of them militants, but also many not. Both parties claim to be responding to the provocations of the other, but much of the conflict reflects a consistent failure on all sides to understand the legitimacy of the other's narrative. To Palestine, the Palestinian people have been denied a state not just since the formation of Israel, but also for decades before that, and now they live under what amounts to a military occupation. And that's all true. To Israel, the Jewish people clearly need a homeland, which the United Nations established. And they certainly aren't the first nation state to consolidate and increase their territory via military victory. And they need to protect their nation against the many active threats made against them by their neighbors. That's also true. It's important to understand the internal logic of these competing nationalist visions. For both Zionist and Palestinian national visions to eventually work, it's necessary to understand the right of each to exist and the legitimacy of each's historical narrative. But these problems aren't thousands of years old, and they aren't intractable. They emerged in the British Mandatory period. But let's hope that by understanding that this isn't an endless religious war, that we might be closer to seeing its end. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is filmed here in the Chad and Stacy Immicold Studio.
That's Crash Course. They're a great source, and they are what got me through college, even through like my philosophy class there. I don't know how to get this smaller. Wow. Okay, so we are kind of coming up on our time. We are not going to watch this video, and that's okay. I hope that this was informative. I'm sure you've heard a lot of more recent events in the news, and I think this helps kind of paint the background picture and makes it a little bit more clear. So as we said in the beginning, my hope is that we have more compassion for oppressed and displaced people.
Yes.
And when we have that compassion doesn't rule out having compassion for another oppressed and displaced people.
So the bad guys are the British.
Maybe we'll say the bad guy is human greed or something. For those that are curious, I think I took this slide out. I must have, but kind of the current stance for the international community as well as the Episcopal Church is to support, and the Anglican Communion at large, the bishops in Jerusalem as well, is to support a two-state solution that goes back to the UN partition plan. That is supported by pretty much everyone except Israel, the UK, and America. And so
the president came out just last night that saying that after, once the skirmish is over, that it needs to be a two-state region.
Well, we flip back and forth. Yes. So during the Obama years, Obama had a support for a two-state solution. During Trump's presidency, he made Jerusalem the capital, or moved the embassy to Jerusalem, which caused some more inflame. I think that was actually on one of the charts that we passed around. It might not have been. But for the U.S. as a whole legal declaration, they do not support a two-state solution. The other kind of solution is, some would say, a one-state solution, that there is not a Jewish state, there is just a Palestinian state with political representation for both Jews and Muslims and Christians and just the people in the region. There was one other video I took out that was kind of arguing for that point of view. And I found out that in a lot of college classes, they make students debate and pick one of those kind of perspectives.
Alexander, did you?
Oh, it was in that timeline. Talked about the movie.
Andrea was telling us this morning, Brotherhood, about these two South Africans that were at Tyson House.
I just got off the phone with
both sides of the South African issue of apartheid money.
Yeah.
And they sat down and talked it through. Both of them were, very committed to their side of the argument. And the whole thing was, you've got to listen to each other and you've got to be willing to be vulnerable and share your hurt.
Yeah. That's why I like the John Green or the Crash Course video, is recognize both people's narratives as both being true. Bill?
How in the heck is another $105 billion showing compassion for the Palestinians? There are 400, the border between Gaza and Egypt is, I guess, the main thoroughfare. On a typical day, there are 400 trucks that cross that border. There have been fewer than 50 that have gotten in there in the last 2 weeks. If we're going to give $105 billion to Israel so they can buy more mortars and more rockets and more things of war, how is that showing compassion? This thing politically is such a sacred cow. And, what I'm saying could be interpreted as anti-Semitic, I suppose. But no politician is willing to stand up and say, wait a minute, Israel, we're going to put some conditions on this $105 billion, as if we have another $105 billion to give away.
So on the money from the U.S., there is conditions that it goes to humanitarian aid and defense. But I'm not a geopolitical expert, and I don't pay attention. I didn't read whatever their bill was of sending money. But yeah, when we get to questions like that as American citizens, and also realizing America is in the minority in the international community for the kind of positions we make as a country, hopefully can inform some of the ways that you vote, or at least the letters you send to your politicians. Because when you look back at the history, you can't help but look at situations with a little more nuance like that and go, wait a second, maybe we should think a little differently about this.
We're actually going to have living room conversations on this topic with the Brotherhood. That's our next topic.
That might be something the whole church should take part in. I asked some of the clergy if they could be here today, but no one was able to.